Hello, and welcome to the People Grow Places podcast, where we explore the virtuous circle of people, growth, and place. Brought to you by Grow Places and hosted by our founder, Tom Larson.
Oh, hi, Martin.
Hello.
How are you?
I'm good, Tom. How are you?
Yeah,
I'm just loving your equipment. I'm quite impressed by the fact it's low-key, portable, pretty easy to understand, and it just reminds me of the first broadcast I ever did was in the BBC studio with 3 massive cameras, 6 mics, 2 presenters, and an entire panel of people behind actually trying to get this 2-minute segment out of the way.
Yeah, well, it shows how far everything's come.
It's the future, isn't it?
How much more accessible everything is to everyone. And
democratic, collaborative, those words, creative, and of course cohesive, I hope.
Exactly. Yeah, well, I'm an ongoing student of the YouTube University. Perfect. So that's where I learned everything about these cameras and...
I do my podcast modules at the moment.
Exactly.
How if you do make a mistake, it's okay to stop and start the question again, rather than do what I previously did, just ramble on and then have to edit the stuff out later. But hopefully we won't be doing that today.
No, well, I don't do too much editing on these, so we'll carry on. But I'm sure it won't need it, Martin, with you.
I'll do my best. Being Irish, one has a facility for words, but not always briefly.
Exactly. So just to start things off then, Martin, the theme of the podcast is exploring the virtuous circle between people, growth and place, and this idea that places help people to grow, and then as people grow and society grows, that helps places to grow. I'm keen to get your opinion, on a number of things, but particularly this, given that you're not a built environment professional.
Not at all, no.
Yeah, and so what does that mean to you, if anything? And
I think initially I would probably challenge the notion that places create people. So if you think about people like Jane Jacobs, for example, architecture writer, great studier of the built environment. Really, as she pointed out, people create places, and then places have a residual effect on people, which in turn stimulates people in a way that continuously changes place. And I guess the key principle on one of her great books, where she looks at the life and death, or the death and life of American cities, she says as soon as you start to plan any kind of neighborhood or any kind of community and assume that the planning will give you serendipity and will give you momentum and will give you what she calls the adjectives of community, you are essentially making a mistake from the beginning. So when she looks at cities like New York, Toronto, Vancouver, and she says where the best neighborhoods were created, they came out of the chaos and the smelliness and the disgust and energy and drama and serendipity of people. And she said if you take that as a principle and a departure point, that will then create a virtuous circle that allows you to develop community and neighborliness, and the notion of how she didn't use the term intersectionality, but it was what she was pushing towards, that all of these things brushing together, cheek by jowl, eventually leads to a better, more creative, more collaborative, and, as she says, sustainable place. But when we plan it in the way that I suspect we now look at precincts, or the way we look at place making, and that term in itself tells us a lot about how we're assuming it's the architect that's responsible rather than the people. As soon as you put the planners, the architects, the engineers, and all of those people in charge without reference and without a kind of conversation with the people who inhabit these spaces, you end up with those great barren, desolate, windswept concourses that we are forever seeing generation on generation. And yet what were we promised originally? The city of the future, utopia, the great skyways in the clouds, etc., etc. And what we end up with is, emptiness, graffiti, tar barrels burning, burnt out cars, and gangs roaming the underpasses while people sit in the towers wondering what the hell has gone wrong. So I think people first, then planning, then community comes after it.
Yeah. Well, that's really good to hear your perspective on that. And I think, we haven't actually mentioned this, but I've actually been promoting an agenda which is around place growth rather than place making, for exactly
good term.
that kind of reason. because it's not this kind of authoritarian idea of a master plan or a plan of any sort in that sense. It's about enablement and about creating, space and places that, as you say, allow the kind of chaos of life to take things in a different direction. And the idea that any one person or entity can kind of control that is...
it's tough, isn't it? Because I always accept that a certain amount of planning and intervention is needed. And, when we think about great, beautiful cities, we will put Paris in that reference point. We'll put Rome in that reference point. London, probably New York, and they're the great city of grids. In some ways, they were the great city of the Grand Boulevards, the kind of gridded system, the mapping, where it was about control and about Cartesian geometry and about this great sense of symmetry. And I get that, but when you look to the edges of them, you see the medieval quarters and you see the intrusions and you see how these in themselves have created chaos. And I think we almost need to not plan them together, but accept that they sit side by side. And as soon as you try to occlude one or refuse the other, which is also what happens when we say, we don't want modernity, we don't want structured planning, we don't want these new kind of road systems, it equally leads to disassociation and I guess a sense of dissonance as to what cities are about. Because some cities grow organically and we go fantastic, the kind of medieval parts of Paris are still beautiful to visit. But also, I think LA has a beauty to it. And it is just a series of roads in search of a heart. But we still love the fact that it has this sort of sense of a massive plan that's just been thrown down, and then everybody's inhabited it without really thinking of, why they're there.
Yeah.
So I kind of feel that it's an ongoing conversation that one needs to be part of it rather than just one constantly. Because at the moment, I think in England particularly, we risk getting rid of the planners and getting rid of the architects and allowing just, equally vested interest groups to determine what our community should look like. And I think that's equally wrong. It is about dialogue and debate.
Yeah, definitely. And those examples of cities that you gave there, I'd actually say probably London is slightly different in terms of, the notion of it, city of villages, and it is less structured than maybe, Paris or New York was. And they each have their charm, but promoting ideas that people can walk, can know their neighbours, can have kind of community, I think is really, really important. And some of that, as you say, just evolves naturally over time. So stepping back from that for a second, so you personally, Martin, you're founder of the Future Laboratory. You've kind of dedicated this part of your working life to consulting on visualising and describing the future. So why the future for you? What is it about that?
I think it's because everything else has been determined and everything else has been laid out. And, I came from Ireland in the 80s. And I always remind people, if you think about your childhood, a lot of people, if you look at photographs or you look at kind of memories people keep, it's always sunny and it's always bright and it's always an idealistic view of, what the past was like. Ireland was monochrome and uniformly dark and depressing. And my memory of it was always a damp place and for desperate people, including myself. And when I kind of looked at the things I was thinking about, and in my early days as a journalist, the things I was writing about, it was always about the optimistic view of tomorrow, or the next, or art, or culture, or design, as it intruded on the everyday. So my kind of view of it was always to think optimistically about what could be. So a better Dublin, as it was then, better rights for gay people, as I am, or better understanding of if you're vegetarian or pescatarian or whatever, that these have positions. And while they sat in the past, the opportunity is always to build into the future. So what does the world look like if gay people, trans people, heteronormative people are all kind of together in it equally and are all planning to get it right? What does it look like if we are designing an urban landscape? Because I came from a rural, agrarian, maritime village. So I'm used to the countryside and I love it, but I really don't want to live in it. But when I move to my cities, I want my cities to encompass and embrace key things that sit, the notion of the biophilic city, the city with water, the city with neighbourhoods I can walk through. I mean, I'm a great gossip. I love meeting people and chatting. That was part of the bit of Ireland I remembered. So my sense of building the future or being part of that is always about how do you map that? And do you do that, through didactic viewpoints about tomorrow, or is it about a collaborative, regenerative, discursive process? And that, I think, is where you end up talking about futurism and forecasting in the way that I think it needs to be done, where everybody is trying to iterate the plan and everybody is trying to go, what could a better tomorrow look like? Because at the Future Laboratory, we always talk about the notion of making a better future happen. And the way you do that is, first of all, you've got to imagine what those options could be, and then you've got to go, so what are we brave enough to do? What are we responsible enough to take on and know that there is a consequence? And also, what are the bits we don't know about? The serendipity of this thing. And that kind of, I guess, when we set the business up in 2001, not a great year to set things up. You can what was happening in 9/11, Twin Towers. But it reminded us that at that day when it happened, we were literally about to kick off the business. And you end up going, okay, this is pretty disastrous, but what are the alternatives? There's a great quote from one of the oversight committees looking into how 9/11 happened. And yes, it's terrorism. Yes, it's ideological differences. Yes, it's kind of debates about culture and relevance. But they said underneath all of that, it was caused by a failure of the imagination. So the other bit of forecasting and looking at the future is understanding the role imagination plays in that process. And I think that's where, as a business, we tend to look at what I call the adjective of tomorrow as well as the potential fact. Mm-hmm. And I guess, for planning, the areas you work in architecture, in some ways, architects are always striving to create different. I don't meet many architects who want to build a building that looks like somebody else's building. So in that sense, there's an individuality, embraced in it. And increasingly, they're trying to come up with a sustainable solution, a people-based solution, a solution that has purpose to it. And they're all the things that the future requires. Mm-hmm. What was fit for the past, and this is why I think when you hear people like King Charles, so as a title, right, talking about architecture like it's something that's held in stasis, like some medieval or British bucolic moment that just should be replicated into the future. It's nonsense. It's not just nonsense, because what was fit for the past is not fit for tomorrow. And our job is always to think about what is the best case we can come up with to make tomorrow work more effectively. And I fear when people don't do that, they're failing on the now, but they're not contributing to the next. And that's the other bit I guess we would think about, is what and how do we contribute to the next in a way that makes the effort worth it.
Yeah. Well, because as you were talking there, the idea, the quote came to mind of, that the future is made, not found, isn't it? Which is kind of quite interesting in the almost paradoxically in the way we were talking about places there. But there is this idea that you have to go out and make the future, and it's the ideas of today and the actions of today will kind of shape what happens going forward, and that's on a kind of societal level, but also on an individual level. And so how does that? I'm sort of referencing your book, which I read a number of years ago. And I was actually going to say, are you really looking at the future or are you looking at today? And because actually the process is actually quite a sort of archaeological one, isn't it? About talking to people,
really
looking at today, and then sort of projecting forward from, some early adopters, some kind of different perspectives.
I think you are looking at today, but you're looking at anomalous peaks that are appearing or disruptions that are bubbling up that would suggest there's something thermal beneath that is changing the now. And I always think those bubbles and those eruptions and those kind of pattern changes are seeds of what something else could look like. So one is you're looking for those seeds in the first place. So you're looking at innovators. You're focusing on who they are, what they're doing, what it is they're developing, because it could be an innovation rather than the person. And then you're kind of going, okay, how are other people betting on these things and investing in them? And then how are people talking about them? Because you can have an idea, like, do you remember the Segway?
Yeah.
You think about Segway, people hailed it as the great success for transport in the future. But anybody who looked at it knew there was one problem with it. You couldn't lift it. So the problem is you came to a curb and you had to hop off. It was like, I always think it was like the Daleks. Nobody ever spotted the flaw of the Daleks, is that you just had to run up the stairs. Then they couldn't get to you. And then finally a producer said, we've got to make them fly. But it was really an awkward script moment where any kid watching that just go, why aren't they flying? Or why aren't you going upstairs? So I think it's the same with a lot of things we look at is you've got the innovator bit, which could be the disruption in the now, and then you have the early adopter bit, which is when people are talking about it and betting on it. And that's how I know that my sense of observation, my sense of analysis about the now and where potential is going to is taking off, not as a fad or as what I call a cul-de-sac or a segue, as it was with the Segway, but then it becomes something that will catch on. So that you can also apply a framework and a measure and a logic to testing that principle. And I think more times than not, those who do it well get it right because you're not looking at a rational measure by itself. You're looking at the human measure and how people spread things through networks or viral exchanges or social media, and how that idea becomes sticky as it's forced further and further out. So a lot of the time we're monitoring, probably when I look at percentages, 13% of a population we'll focus on, from innovator, early adopter to early majority, to see how they are handling ideas, and if they are handling it in the what I call the forward-pointing way, which is what you're looking for, that idea will go viral and will also become a major trend, versus an idea like the Segway, where it really didn't happen. Although the technology was great, the description of it was great. There was nothing wrong with the imagery of people zooming up and down street. It's just when you got to a step, you were pretty fucked. Yeah. And that's a major bar to going into tomorrow, I think.
Exactly. There's a big generational aspect to this as well, isn't there? Your mapping and understanding of how different age ranges, different generations, obviously different cultures as well, think about the world. How do you see that? Is it as black and white as saying, look at the younger generation because they're the future? Or
I think it used to be. I think that the problem is we're now forgetting about how intergenerational knowledge has developed and how behaviors and mindsets are not necessarily reflective of a body clock or an age. And what I mean by that is that it's very easy to take something like the culture wars, for example, and assume that it's young people who support the openness and the rights of and the equalities of, and that as you move away from your Gen Z and push into higher age groups, it becomes more and more conservative. Research shows that sort of holds up for some things, but not for everything. Yeah. And what I think you also look for is what ideas are traveling quickly through a population, what ideas are being challenged, but more, I guess, fundamentally, what are those challenges about? So, for example, if you think about the culture wars, or the woke wars, as we sometimes talk about in America, I go, there are certain sets of things we now accept. We don't debate. So, gay equality, female equality, which has not been achieved, but people are nominally saying yes, it's fine. Black Lives Matter, that's fine. It causes debate, but fuck me, you're going to argue with that, you're in serious trouble. But there are certain points people then start arguing about. So they will start looking at trans movement and go, okay, we accept this, but not that. That's where it needs to be open for debate, not for closure. But it needs to be open to debate in the realities of, if a trans person is telling you this, this, and this, why are you challenging them? If my name is Martin, or I'm called Martin, so I'm changing my name, well, why do you object to it? And these are the things I point out to people. This is like, sometimes our objections are reactive to. That could be an age thing, but it could just be a class thing. It could be a political thing. And It could be a social thing. It could be a neighborhood thing. Those things are not related to age. They're related to location, context, consequence, and I think how people embrace openness and knowledge. So the easy answer is to blame it on age. There is a more complex answer that we would have to look at, whereby, and if you get that, then you can look at groups, and those groups can feel in positions where they are enabling people to be different, to be more open, by being embraced in that culture. You know, the more you understand that everybody should be equal and are equal, and the less they should have to fight for it, the more we can get on and do the things that are really about saving the planet, or, you know, changing the sense of equality or age or incomes or whatever. And I think we are wasting a lot of time on things that ultimately, in 10 years, 5 years, will not matter, but they will have stopped us from working out commonalities, consensus, and how we can fucking get the planet sorted and get on to the next stage. Mm-hmm. So I think that a lot of our time in business is, it's looking at the trend or looking at the shift, the social cultural norm, how that could be age-related, but how, if you find stepping stones and consensus, you can make sure everybody is understanding it. Yes, people will object, what we call the laggards, but they will object to everything. Yeah. And the great thing I've discovered about laggards, they die sooner or later. So the attrition and the annoyance and the objection they cause is absolutely removed at some point. Yeah. So how do you get a cause up and underway? Well, you can do everything or nothing. Some people advise do nothing, because within 15 years, all of those people who object will be left and gone from the planet. So you just get on to your life. Yeah. You know, that's the bit I often worry about is, but then I suppose the Irishman in me thinks, you know what, if you really stand in my way, I really want to challenge you, because it's just, it's wrong that you should feel, while you have a right to something in the sense of your opinion, it's not necessarily a right in the sense of responsibility and human progression. Mm. So it's worth defending these things, but sometimes we just need to find consensus to open up the debate and the conversation.
Yeah, well, absolutely. It is totally worth defending, as you say. And you referenced Jane Jacobs earlier, and she talks about, again, the idea that innovation, whether it's cultural innovation or progression, you know, is kind of something that is kind of an urban idea, and then it sort of spills out into other locations. Yeah. There's that kind of locational factor, as you were saying, in that as well. And you mentioned earlier, you know, planting seeds or uncovering seeds of the future, and then so if we project kind of 10 years forward, which is, you know, it's a substantial amount of time in people's sort of lives, but in reality, it's not actually that far away. You know, what if anything in 10 years' time do you think will be the same, or you know, and what will really be different, particularly around people?
Yeah,
there's always change. You know, the world is always changing, but the headlines at the moment are obviously, you know, with artificial intelligence, with other such things, this kind of exponential speed of progression, or at least how it feels to people, is exactly that, kind of exponential.
I think it's interesting. I always think, you know, if you look at examples in the past, so if you were born in 1880 and you look at 1930, think about it as a timeline and the differences. You know, you've kind of a world where you've got, you know, telegraph, photography, aviation hasn't happened. You've got hot air balloons, steamships. You know, you've got gathering at different forces of communication. Somebody thinking about TV, not invented yet. But then by 1925, we've got television, we've got cubism, we've got modernism, we've got general theory of relativity from Einstein. You've got a whole massive shift. But still, I'm seeing horses on the road. Still, I'm seeing, you know, massive industrial complexes. I'm seeing poverty. I'm seeing animals. You know, kind of goats in the city, cows in the city, etc. So what you understand is that the future is never clean. It's never linear. And in fact, 20 years of what had gone before will still sit within the same time frame of the future. So while we may have, and we will have AI, we'll have quantum, you know, we'll have VR, we'll still have horses in the city. You know, we will still have diesel cars unless legislation. So what you have to see is it's a slightly untidy, dirty, cheek by jowl future where what tends to happen then is the best ideas or the most advantageous ideas or those ideas that allow us to be better, faster, sharper, or more about our personal positioning begin to come through. So then they take on the dominant form. So AI won't happen overnight, but when it does, it'll look like it's calcifying really quickly. And then that will be like in the way there were no laptops in our houses, then there are laptops everywhere. You know, the way there was no wireless, and then it was a privilege, and it was a business tool, and now it's an expectation. It's a kind of a standard-based right. So I think that's the bit that we'll start looking at. It's how those things like AI won't be just a tool of the elite, or they won't just be a tool of business. It will pretty much permeate our lives in the way that I think oxygen does, you know, in the way that electricity does. And I think at that point, we will be having the debates about its uses. You know, if you think about electricity, it can do two things. It can power our homes, and it can be benign, or it can be used to electrocute people. Like, think about the electric chair in America. So this fear we have of AI is exactly the same fear as we had of electricity at the beginning of its journey. But I just think that the city of the futures will also have existential threats. So, for example, climate change. Because within 10 years, if we haven't done what we've been tasked to do now, we have pretty much gone beyond the point where, unless pretty revolutionary technologies are deployed, it is too late for parts of the world. So then you'll have to think about immigration as a reality, not as a thing that you want to ignore. You'll have to think about food security. You'll have to think about energy resource depravity. And then you will have dominant forces. If you read any magazines like your kind of foreign affairs and that, you know, the real existential threat will also be where a dominant business, corporation, or country will believe it can gain positioning by using brute force. And whether that brute force is technical or physical or a combination of both, it could be an inevitability that we live in a world where daily, as is happening in the Ukraine, we will have to be defending ourselves and be constantly at a state of war because climate, energy, population shift, and I think the rise of totalitarianism will become real threats that actually, being in the West and being further up north, because if you look at the geographical issues, these have protected us traditionally. And now all of these things, because of globalization, because of the internet, because of cyber security, because of AI, all of these things suddenly put everybody within the same threat arena. And I think that's the problem that people are not looking at. We're looking at very personal things and very private things. And in England, we've become more insular than ever. You know, this notion of Brexit, it has achieved nothing except to remind us of how, when you're alone and without friends, the more vulnerable you become. So that's the shifts. Will I see England returning to Europe as part of that future? Potentially, not in the current system, because I think Europe has debates and issues it needs to look at. But I think the future could be dangerous if we don't do things now. On the other hand, if AI is the way I think it will be, and if quantum is the way I think it could be, and if nuclear, the pulling together of two atoms in a way that gives us heat as powerful and productive as the sun will be, then suddenly we have stepped into a new paradigm and a new world. So 1880 to 1925, it could be that beautiful if we get it right. Or it could be into 1929, when you had the great stock market crash, and then the beginning of the World War. It could equally be brutal. Yeah. We just need to kind of decide now which way we want to go with it. But we need to be responsible, and we need to be proactive. And at the moment, I think we're being reactive, we're being regressive, and we're pulling ourselves back, resource in energy, in thinking, in opportunity, at a time we need to be pushing ourselves out. There's a long answer. That's a very long answer, Martin.
No, it is, but there's a massive amount in that, and I'm glad you kind of sort of came around to kind of what is the kind of optimistic side of it, because I was going to actually ask you that as my next question.
Yeah, I was being a bit pessimistic, but
I don't think I wasn't implying that. Because it is real, and this is what people are feeling. But I do wonder, about what is the kind of the better case out of this.
It's kind of, I think, to what I guess previous thinking is, it hasn't happened. So the doomsayers and the dystopians and the people who always look for dark scenarios, I go, that's great, that's an opportunity. And maybe as human beings, we tend towards that because it's probably more interesting and a bit more sort of frightening and scary and stimulating. But we can also tend towards the optimistic. And there is a whole generation of forecasters, of planners, of futurists, and increasingly thinkers, philosophers, ethicists, and say, actually, given that you can have multiple opportunities for tomorrow, why not try to promote the optimistic? But being realistic about that. There is a population issue, there is an immigration issue, there is an income inequality issue, there's a genuine threat for democracy is in decline, and totalitarianism or populism is on the rise. Set that with the technologies we're seeing, set that with the real looming threat of climate change, but use that as part of your scenario casting and your process to work out, those being constraints and challenges, how could there be opportunities?
Just stepping back a little bit from that point and on something you mentioned before, the question that kind of comes from this idea about forecasting and mapping the future. Do you think, if you look back, are there any trends about how the future emerges with respect to sectors? Because we always talk in the built environment and construction as being almost like the laggards in a way in the industry, whether that's around innovation or just pace of adoption of technology or use of data or all these other things. And there are a number of kind of complex reasons for that in terms of, the fact that we are talking about building, physical things in cities, in cultures, and change. It's obviously it's not like producing a new technological app, for example. Yeah. But do you think that there is a pattern around the types of industries maybe that sort of lead the way, that maybe the built environment could sort of look at or learn from in terms of where things are going?
Yeah, I think the issue of the built environment is there's a time issue. Obviously, because things take time to complete. So I always think if it takes 5 years to put up complex X or building Y, there's an assumption that by the time it's complete, it's fit for purpose. So I always think to do that kind of competently, you need to be looking at clues which suggest to you. So what's happening in kind of tech, what's happening in cultural shifts, what's happening in social change, what's happening in areas about what I call consumer discourse. So what are the things we're discussing? What are the things that are rising up? And what you do by mapping all of those things, you're understanding what starts off as a tiny marginal conversational gambit, let's say about in the 60s, for example, the early burst of the environmental movement was tied into early appearances of the psychedelic movement, was tied into early appearances of a huge sea change in how music was performed and produced and put together. And that came on the back of a youth problem or a youth quake or a massive youth wave. So depending on how you looked at it, there were enough indicators to show you where the momentum was going to. On top of that, you had in 68, the first shots of Earth seen from the moon, the kind of the blue marble effect. So that accelerated how we saw this thing as a fragile planet. So what I always look for is how you're building up the socio-theory of change. Hence, if I'm then putting together a building, because you've got an architect or planning teams or commissioning or cities, what they should be looking at, which is what I think they don't look at, is, so what are the things coming through now that in 5 years will be commonplace? So I remember chatting to architects and kind of leaseors and city councils in the 90s and noughties, where you were saying that neighborhoods will become important. The inter-exchange possibilities, the fact that you see more people living on the streets, not living in the skies, lack of cars, and we didn't say get rid of the cars, lack of cars, more green spaces, more concern about the environment, recycling, purpose. These were things that were already in the culture and were being debated, and you could see them coming through. They weren't listening. They wanted, verticality. They wanted efficiency. They wanted to remove at street level, like the shops, the door entrances, the windows that overlook, because they wanted this kind of sense of the big foyer, the grand entrance, the great gesture moment, and then you were sucked up into the brand and the kind of thinking. And all of that, to me, was running against what was on the street. And therefore, I could see there was going to be a lot of failures. But it's impossible unless you, as an architect and as a planner and as a builder, are immersed in those things. The problem is we're looking at our own industry. The solution is never in our own industry. Because look what's happening now. A lot of buildings that were built then are being pulled down. They're being, people basically are decommissioning them. They're not occupied. They feel cold. They are draining energy. They're slightly kind of... They make you feel ill when you're in them, but you're not quite sure why. It's the lighting, it's the way the floor plate has been designed, the ceiling's lowered, the lack of space, etc., because we weren't looking at what people demanded. So I always think it's not just about the technologies that give us clues, it's about the social conversations, the cultural shifts, the debates that sit on the fringes. Because remember, all ideas begin on the edge and move to the center. So any sensible, observant person isn't looking at the center. That's dead. That's already done. So whatever is there will be out of date in 10 years anyway, or 20 years, whatever. Look to the edges, listen to that, pull it in, build accordingly. So there are some architects I speak to now, and they're thinking about 20 years' time. And I go, what are you seeing for 20 years' time? They're seeing biophilic, they're seeing open plan, they're seeing glass, they're seeing precincts, they're seeing urban forests. I go, you're already dead. These things are so out of date now because they're not answering the question about what is it we will need in our cities and what we should be doing next.
So I know it's a very simple question, but what do you think we need then? If you were writing the brief for,
as in for the buildings of tomorrow.
For the buildings, what would be your brief today for buildings that are going to emerge in 5 to 10 years' time?
I think, it depends entirely on the location, and it depends entirely on the country, and it depends entirely
let's talk London.
So if you talk about London, I'd say, first of all, people talk about the high rises in London. I think buildings are not really high in London. When you visit other places, Singapore, you go to Beijing, the US, it isn't about height anymore. It's about utility, and it's about need and requirement. So there's a real push now to return people to the centre of the city. I'm not talking go back to the office. I'm talking about how cities, in a way like Paris and Barcelona, Rome to an extent, etc. These cities are for people, and I think there is a requirement that we dismantle easy, clear zoning between, business district, social district, park districts, and we collapse them together one. We need to look at why of cities, because business is no longer a reason for going to this. It shouldn't be a reason for going to a city centre hard. So what is the why there? So we need to consult the community, the social. The more you look at the social thing, the more you can stitch together what the physical hardware should look like. And I think the problem is we put the hardware first, and then we think, oh, fuck, how does it run? It needs software to run it. So what we should be doing is going, what is the requirement of cities now? It is about more engagement, more culture, more foot movement, more retention through entertainment, through interaction, through not just shopping, but exchanges of experience. So I think of cities now, they were about shopping. Now they should be about experience. So what does that experience look like? Because retail is no longer the thing that brings us to the city. It is about entertainment, it's experience, it's adventure, it's journey, it's discovery. You can't do that currently in cities because they're still orientated towards 9 to 5 or 7 to 2. So we've still broken them down into two moments of either spend here or get trashed here. And we're not looking at, that's part of why we go to a city, but it used to be probably the only reason we stay there. Now that's changing. So my question is putting it back. What is it that people want to do, and how does our current infrastructure service those needs?
Yeah.
That's a long answer.
No, it is, but, you talk about cities, and cities generally are very resilient, elements, some more so than others. But, if you ask people in Detroit whether a city is resilient, they would say probably, in terms of what happened in terms of, the motor industry.
It was built on one industry, and it put its resource into that, and everything was lensed through it. And now Detroit's coming through a second, third regeneration.
50 years later.
Yeah, but that's sometimes that,
that's how long it takes.
The lifetime of a city, that maybe isn't a long time. Yeah. It's unfortunate for the people, but actually it's more unfortunate that people allow these things because it's kind of mono-industrial, and we kind of go, yeah, it's great, it's generating jobs, revenue, blah blah blah. But ultimately, a city dependent on one thing is a city that is open to the vulnerabilities of geography and innovation. Right. And as you know, disruption doesn't come from within; it comes from without. Yeah. And if that happens and you're not prepared, then you will be a Detroit. You will be those cities that don't survive the future.
Yeah. So as I say, we've got a closing tradition on this podcast, which is where the previous guest writes down a question for you without knowing who's coming.
It could be.
Yeah, and then I'll ask you after this to write one down. And this one, by chance, is actually probably quite relevant for you, very relevant for you. So how do you see the future relationship between science and nature developing? And they've put in brackets here around biophilia, allergens, and AI.
I think, how do I see the difference between science and nature developing? Is science is nature and nature is science. I don't see any oppositions, or I don't see any contradictions, and I don't see any reason for segregating them out. And in fact, if you think about the Enlightenment, science, nature, philosophy, astrology, astronomy, biology, and lots of kind of slightly odd Christian sects, beliefs, and sciences and the mystical all sat together. And they're what I think it's E.O. Wilson refers to consilience, the notion that all these things feed off each other. And if you understand that, you see what's a solution here will probably help you there, but only if you see the connections. And I think we had spent from the 18th century onwards rationalizing and creating linear divisions and suitable divides between what was the kind of cultural life, the humanities life, the science life, and the spiritual and kind of physical life. And I think we're now seeing these things be brought together again. So suddenly, if I look at quantum, and I look at AI particularly, I'm seeing quite big philosophic questions being asked, and quite big ethical and spiritual. And that actually is great, because it means that we're understanding the sciences and nature are not things that sit in opposition. They are things that sit in harmony. It's just that we have refused to spot those harmonies. So the current issues we're seeing is climate change, is seeing that it's man in, opposition to nature. Man, unfortunately, is natural. You can't really get away from that. We are part of a natural cycle. We are part of nature. So to say that nature is attacking itself is probably more fair, but also to understand that within the problems we're seeing, the solutions are already coming through. And we need to put them together to understand that the two things contain opportunities for the other, and that we shouldn't be separating them in conversation. The notion of consilience as a liberal arts science. We talk about STEM, and we're now talking about STEAM with the arts back into it. We shouldn't be talking about them. It's like LGBTQI+. The reason we've had to segregate that out is because we recognize there was a monolith that needed breaking up. But as you finally see, and you come to the end of that sequence, you realize it's pretty much everybody on a spectrum. And I think that's the same with science and nature. And the more we embrace the spectrum approach and see that they're interconnected, the more we come up with a solution. If we talk to them as two different things and realizing it's the same thing, we're still in trouble. We're seeing that if I come up with a scientific solution, well, you hate nature. If I'm a natural person, well, you're pointless, aren't you? Because that's, organic is not going to save the planet, etc., etc. So bring them together and understand that they're part of the same journey and a spectrum along which we all sit. Some of us just looking at it differently. Get it together, and we will solve the problem.
Martin, thank you very much. Really grateful for your time and all your insights. It's always amazing, and you know how much I value the relationship and talking to you. So Thank you for your time.
I'm glad you do. And who was that person that went behind us? That was obviously a nature lover.
Exactly.
Coming to interrupt our
He did have
science.
his clothes on though, so
That's
it's all
fine.
good.
Yeah, that's naturalist, isn't it? Naturism. Naturism.
Naturism, yeah. Good one. Thanks, Martin.
Pleasure.
Thank you for listening to the People Grow Places podcast. For more information, visit growplaces.com and follow us at We Grow Places across all social channels. See you next time.